We'll get started because, as ever, we've got a lot of slides to get through. There's a lot of content there, so we'll press on. What we're going to cover today is, as we've called it, it's kind of a pre-settlement briefing on what we think might be going on. Just to give you a bit of a heads up about the settlement itself, which looks very likely to now be the week after next, so the week beginning the 13th of December. So it's almost upon us. So what we'll be looking at is at that provisional settlement, but taking a bit of a step back as well and looking at what Michael Gove, the new Secretary of State, has said about where he thinks where he wants local government funding to move to. We'll look more specifically at what that might mean for some of the funding scenarios for us over the next 3 years, and then more specifically at the settlement itself, how that 1.5 billion might be distributed, what the options might be, what's in the 1.5 billion, what you need to put in your budget to fund from that, and then look at some of the council tax thresholds as well. So there's quite a lot of detail there that we'll go through. We'll look a little bit at the social care reforms, the funding and the costing, but I don't really have an awful lot to tell you about that. Just some thoughts about how that might be progressed and some of the latest developments, and just really questions back to you about how much you're able to do of that. Then Dan will take over. He's got a lot of really interesting analysis on council tax base, what's going on there, which is really, I think, useful, especially in the context of what Michael Gove has said about tax base. But we know how important tax base is to us in local government. And then I'll finish off just looking at the NNDR3, which is out a couple of weeks ago. Look at what that might mean for us, both in terms of the impact of the pandemic on business rates, but also what that might mean for a business rate baseline reset. So we'll jump straight into it and start off by looking at what Michael Gove, Secretary of State, has said at the recent Select Committee that was back at the beginning of November. So these are just a few extracts from that appearance at the Select Committee. He talked about councils with the most resilient council tax base and the highest proportion of business rates, relatively speaking, being in a stronger position, and referred specifically to councils in the southeast, which I thought was quite interesting. But clearly there is an issue there, and we know it very well, about councils that have larger tax bases probably on balance being in a better position than most other types of authority. He also talked about not moving precipitately in that direction. Not an easy word for him to say, or me to say, to be honest, but I think what that means really is that he's saying decisions that haven't been made, they're not going to move too quickly. So, they've still got things to think about. Decisions not been made yet. I thought this was an interesting concept as well, talking about creating headroom for redistribution of funding to better reflect the additional needs and responsibilities. And I just wondered how that concept might be developed of headroom, whether that means that there won't be a full redistribution of, the totality of the SFA that we've got at the moment, and instead he'll be looking to create headroom to redistribute funding to deliver, in quotes, levelling up. He said his objectives are not as crude as seeking to help local authorities in the north, but it was pretty clear from what he did say that that is where he is intending to move money towards, and that will be the success factors that he'll be measuring himself against. He mentioned 117 different pots for which local authorities are encouraged to bid, and said you can have too much of a good thing, but he will be trying to reduce the number of pots. I guess the risk or the issue for us in local government is that when money is increasing, there tends to be more strings attached. So I'm sure there will be attempts to reduce the number of pots, but I don't know how much that will actually be able to put into practice. And then finally, he did reflect that local government is concerned that the NHS has once again grabbed the lion's share of funding. Kind of gave some indication that there might be moves to encourage the NHS to share that with local government, but I don't know how far that will go. And then he used a lot of those arguments, especially around tax base and around business rates, to justify what seemed to be abandoning the move towards 75% business rate retention. I thought one thing that I thought was quite interesting though was he referenced the southeast of England as having large amounts of or high levels of business rate retention. The southeast of England on average doesn't have particularly high levels of retention, But what it does have, you see that in the table there, it's got quite a high level of rateable value per head, second only to London. But its rate retention per head is not particularly high. In fact, it's council tax in the southeast of England on average that tends to be much higher per head than the rest of the country. And that's where I think it gets its strength from. But actually, it's London that's got by far the highest levels of business rate retention and moderately high levels of council tax base as well. So I think that the argument he made actually was a strong one for resetting the business rate baseline and for council tax equalisation, but wasn't necessarily a good argument for not moving towards 75% retention, although that seems to have been a decision that's been made. And Dan's analysis will tell us much more about council tax base as well in a few minutes. So what does that mean possibly about headroom? How might that work? I mean, my guess would be something along the lines of some kind of needs-based formula, based on something like the current SFA, or something like the kind of formula that we've got in the Levelling Up Fund, alongside some kind of council tax equalisation. I thought that was kind of a clear inference you can make from what he said at the Select Committee. But what sort of, and I was guessing that maybe there might be some kind of moves to create some kind of headroom fund. Where might those funds come from? One source might be the 1.5 billion that's going to be in the settlement from the Spending Review 21. There's more money available potentially from the current New Homes Bonus pot, and possibly in the near future from some kind of baseline reset, which could generate anywhere between 1.6 to 1.9 billion potentially. So there are options for creating that kind of headroom pot. Then thinking about what that might mean over the medium term in terms of those kind of scenarios for local government reform package. Now, I think that there are three scenarios you could look at here. One is that there's some kind of full reform package in 23-24. So the things we've been looking at for a number of years now: a fair funding review, a business rate baseline reset. That would create major redistribution within the country. It would benefit most county councils or county areas, or certainly county councils anyway, sorry, and what you might call, again in quotes, red wall type authorities. But there would be really severe losses in lots of southeast counties, but also in parts of London, in London in particular. So lots of movement there. And I think it's, from what I understand anyway, it's fair to say that that full reform package is not off the table yet. I don't think it's been fully dismissed. I think it's probably not entirely likely just because of the amount of redistribution that will create, but it's certainly not off the table yet. Another approach might be, again in 23-24, to have some kind of headroom redistribution. So a lot of the existing resources might be kept in place, but there'll be the attempts to make some kind of headroom pot to redistribute towards and help deliver levelling up, or be seen to be delivering it anyway. That'd be less disruptive, less redistributive. It could be seen to be delivering on levelling up, and it would avoid some of those really huge losses that might happen in sort of southeast counties and inner London. So they're sort of two possible scenarios of what might happen in 23-24, for instance. And the full reform package is still the option that we've got modelled in our MTFP model as well. The third scenario might be the full delay until 25-26. That would allow a multi-year settlement to be announced later this month. But obviously it would delay any big changes in redistribution until 25-26, potentially after the next general election. And I'm not quite sure whether someone like Michael Gove would be willing to wait till as long as that to make any meaningful changes. Some thoughts on that. The first, I mean, in no particular order, but the first is that those scenarios would result in continued uncertainty for high growth authorities. I know when I speak to a lot of you, especially district councils, where you've got a lot of growth, there's quite a lot of uncertainty about, will there be a baseline reset? What happens when it does go on? And you're briefing members about that every year, about that being a huge risk. The little image there's a very, very tiny violin, because for many of you who don't have that level of business rate growth, that's not something you're particularly sympathetic about. And I think it is fair to say, if you've got that business rate growth, it's great to have, and the risk of losing it at some point in the future, is one that probably doesn't generate an awful lot of sympathy in other sorts of authorities. But for those of you who've got it, I know it does it is causing problems as well as being a welcome windfall. I think as well, without any transfers into SFA, the sort of transfers that we would have been expecting alongside 75% retention, I think it becomes a little bit more challenging to make big changes in SFA unless ministers are prepared to accept that concept of negative RSG. You're starting to get into many authorities are already in negative RSG. Any further reductions as a result of a fair funding review would put lots of authorities into quite serious negative RSG unless there are transfers in. It's not impossible, but it does make things slightly more challenging. Will there be any damping for any of those changes, either from a fair funding review or a baseline reset, or from any other types of changes? Often we haven't heard an awful lot about how any damping might work, but for many of you, I know that's a really big concern. What sort of damping will be available? And I think any reforms now will certainly be judged on whether they do deliver levelling up or deliver to areas that seem to be needing levelling up. So that is an opportunity for some authorities in some parts of the country that wasn't there before. So for instance, many Met authorities on the call today, that is an opportunity, I think, to start lobbying and asking for changes in the funding system. Now looking more specifically at provisional settlement, the settlement date's really between the 6th and the 16th of December. Parliament rises on the 16th of December, but I think all the clear indications are now that it's going to be the week after next. So I guess 14th, 15th, 16th, something like that. Will there be 1 year or multi-year allocations? I think that will depend on ministerial decisions about the reforms, the kind of scenarios we've looked at already. But I think a 1 year settlement does now look much more likely than a proper multi-year settlement. If there are going to be changes in funding in 23-24, or the options kept open for that, a 1 year settlement does look much more likely. The LGA are asking for at least indicative numbers for years 2 and 3, but I don't think we're likely to get the kind of certainty over 3 or 4 year period that we got back at the last multi-year spending review. Then we're looking at some decisions around what happens with that 4.8 billion, how much goes to SFA, how much to social care grants, how much into other grants and other funding streams. The allocation of the 3.6 billion for social care reform grants. We'll look at both those two factors and what might happen. We've been told what the expected council tax thresholds are: 2% core, 1% social care precept, £5 for districts. But they're the expected thresholds. I can't see them changing that much for 22-23, but things might change in future years, and we'll look at that again as well. New homes bonus, is it just that one final legacy payment in 22-23, or will we get another one-off 1 year payment again? I guess look at that in the context of does that deliver levelling up, or is that part of the housing incentive sort of objectives that the Secretary of State's got? And any ongoing COVID pressures, I think it's unlikely we'll get any sort of further tranches of funding for COVID, but that kind of pressure might be wrapped up in the funding that we get through the settlement, through that 1.5, 1.6 billion in 22. Just to refresh ourselves about what the core spending power figures were in the spending review. Growth in grant funding is very much front-loaded and then cash flat. So you can see there in the chart, £1.5 billion of new grant in 22-23, then it's flat in years 2 and 3. But there is growing funding for social care reform, but that's not really new spending power. You'll get spending commitments to go alongside that. So it's not strictly speaking new spending power, I don't think. And any growth in resources from 23-24 onwards will come from council tax. Grants flat, so any growth in resources will have to come from council tax. And as you can see, over that period of time, the lion's share of growth in resources will end up coming from council tax. Even with only having a 1% social care precept, council tax will really do the heavy lifting that's required in growing resources. And to my mind, that kind of indicates that possibly the thresholds for council tax might be lifted in years 2 and 3, especially around the social care precept, just because, I think there'll be pressure pressure on local government budgets in those 2 years inevitably, and council tax is one way of dealing with those pressures. Growth within local government funding, within core spending power. The headline was 3% real terms growth, but I think when we strip out the funding for social care reform, the real spending power growth is only about 1.4% in real terms, and most of that will come from council tax. Grant funding within core spending power over the 3 years will only just increase in real terms. How does this compare to previous spending reviews? Actually, fairly well. Certainly, it compares very well to anything before 2020. But as you can see there, the 2021 and 21-22 spending core spending power settlements were pretty good, 6% and 4% in cash terms. And the average for the next 3 years at 4.3% actually compares relatively well to those 2 years. Not quite as high, but certainly nothing like what happened in the 4 years prior to that. And never mind the period 2010 to 2015 when things were really bad. So it's not a bad settlement. It's very much front loaded, as we said, but over that period, 4.3% in cash terms is pretty good. Doesn't quite match the hype I think that was in some of the documentation, but it is. I think it's true to say it's the best sustained rise in core spending power in more than a decade. But I think the emphasis on the word sustained there. So how might ministers go about allocating that 4.5 billion, the 1.5 billion pounds in each year? How would it get split between SFA and social care? And for that matter, how much else might go on other things as well? I've had a few questions about this, so we've been talking to some authorities and thinking about what that might mean. And of course, we've modelled a couple of options in our MTFP model as well. First option is looking at what happened in 21-22. There was less money around in that year, so it was slightly different. But what happened in that year was inflation was applied to only RSG, but that was an uplift of only 0.55%. So there was no uplift for authorities with negative RSG that went through SFA. But the surplus New Homes bonus was reallocated through various grants like RSDG, low tier services grant, and social care as well. And then separately from all that, there was cap compensation paid in respect of the frozen multiplier through Section 31 grant, which is effectively paying inflation on baseline funding level. So that was what happened in 21-22. And I think some people have been saying to me, do you think that'll happen again in 22-23? I think it must be possible. I think it's slightly different in 22-23 just because there's more money around. 1.5 billion is different from just 150 million extra money. Scenario 2, and this is the sort of thing we put in the MTFP model, which is slightly different. We've given you some options about how you might think about how funding might be split between SFA and social care, and I'll show you some of those assumptions on the next slide. And then what we have assumed, which is different from the current year, is that we've assumed that any increase in SFA is allocated pro rata to the 21-22 SFA. So in effect, that ignores the negative RSG that some authorities are effectively affected by. So I know some authorities that have had no RSG for years. In our model, it suggests that you might get some. And the reason for that was simply that there's just more money around, and there might be some real terms growth in SFA. And I thought some of that at least would go to authorities with negative RSG. I thought it was unlikely that ministers might decide to completely dig up the negative RSG and go back to basics again, certainly if just for 1 year. And then for social care funding, I'm assuming that's allocated through a combination of adult R&F and equalisation of the social care precept. Equalisation is a bit less important this year than it was, so in 22-23 than it was in the current year, just because we think there's more funding within social care, or more increase in funding in social care, and the precept's only 1% rather than 3%. So the relationship between new funding and the effective equalisation is quite different. And again, assuming that cap compensation is paid outside that via a separate Section 31 grant. But again, if that effectively applies inflation to baseline funding level. A third approach, which I think is probably a bit less likely, is creating some kind of levelling up headroom fund or pot that can be distributed, and using some or all of that 1.5 billion to do that. plus say the 750 million from New Homes Bonus. I think it's probably a bit more unlikely. That sounds a bit more radical, really. Certainly authorities will be expecting quite a lot of the 1.5 billion to go to social care. So, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen, but there was just ways that we thought you could model it and show what the different approaches might be and what the impact might be on you as an authority. And just recapping on what happened in 21-22, if you start from the top on the right hand side there, you can see only £13 million went into SFA in 21-22. That just applied 0.55% inflation to those authorities that were getting RSG. £150 million went into cap compensation because of the frozen multiplier. I'd expect the same to be the case in 22-23, although the figure I think will be a bit greater than that. Then the increase in council tax, and then we had 300 million for the social care support grant. That was the additional social care grant. 150 million funded from New Homes Bonus surplus. The rest funded from new money. 111 million for low tier support grant, and then the change in New Homes Bonus, which funded a lot of those new little bits of grant. Of course, 4 million additional funding for rural services delivery grant. So that was just to refresh our minds about what happened in 21-22. But of course, the difference this time round is going to be there's just more money to play with. So I think the decisions might be a bit different. Within the model itself, we gave you some options within the systems assumptions tab about how the money might be split between social care and SFA and what the profile might be. So, you know, one approach we thought might happen is that top one, scenario 2A, where we thought the social care grants might be front loaded. We thought SFA growth might just be pegged to inflation. So, you know, 300 million, 600 million, 900 million pounds increase. So 300, basically just keeping pace with inflation. And then the balance going to social care, which will give you that sort of front-loaded social care grant, you know, 1.2 billion falling to say 600 million over that period. Another way of doing it would be just to split social care and SFA up front, you know, and keep both sets of grants flat over that period. I think either's a sort of a valid approach that you might want to model and see what the differences are. For some authorities, it will make quite a big difference. I think for most, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference, to be honest. Our expectation would be that at least 50% of the additional funding goes to social care. My guess would be it'd be a bit more than 50%. But I think that's the kind of benchmark we need to be bearing in mind when we look at the settlement when it comes out in a couple of weeks. A couple of worked examples here, and I've been to talk to a few authorities about how these assumptions might play through. But looking at someone like Harrogate, district council, you know, well into negative RSG, you know, how would our scenario sort of play out for this kind of authority? A few things to know: cap compensation effectively funds inflation based on funding level. We think that will be paid separately. Section 31 grant. Baseline funding level is frozen in cash terms because of the multiplier. But you can see here RSG. We have assumed, you know, that, well, based on the modelling we've done, as a modelling assumption that there might be some RSG for Harrogate, but that would, you know, it really represents some kind of real terms growth, effectively for Harrogate, because you know, you're getting inflation on baseline funding level through cap compensation. But also perhaps for someone like Harrogate, because they've been losing New Homes Bonus without getting big increases in social care grants. You know, they got a reasonably large lower tier services grant payment in 21-22. You know, and that might kick in again if that grant's continued into 22-23, which is what we've assumed in our modelling. You know, that would kick in and potentially, you know, deliver someone like Harrogate fairly large chunks of money. You know, around £500,000 a year, depending on what the assumptions are around RSG and around the other grants, and especially if New Homes Bonus falls off as quickly as we think it might, based on latest proposals. But bottom line for someone like Harrogate is that actually the overall core spending power doesn't shift that much, and that's as much because, you know, if low tier services grant is still in place, you know, that effectively protects the position of someone like Harrogate. You know, so regardless of what we're assuming around RSG or other grants, you know, LTSG might actually fill the gap. And there are lots of authorities now in negative RSG, you know, 168 authorities in negative RSG. So that's a very large share of the of local government. They're mostly shire districts, but there are some unitaries, there are some counties, there are some outer London boroughs as well. You know, it is possible to go back and reconstruct that sort of the real SFA position that every authority's got, but it will be messy, and I think it will be quite disruptive, given that, you know, we've gone for quite a few years now accepting the concept of negative RSG. Then looking at another type of authority, an outer London borough, higher need type authority, and obviously with social care responsibilities. Again, cap compensation, assuming that gets paid through Section 31 grant, frozen baseline funding level. But I think it's a bit more of an easy read over there for what happens with revenue support grant. You know, we'd assume that any increase in SFA that we're assuming will go straight through into revenue support grant. So that's effectively funding inflation as well as growth in any SFA, depending on that split with social care. This authority, because core spending power is not dropping, we're assuming that it wouldn't get any lower tier services grant. You know, just to remember, lower tier services grant back in the current year, 21-22, was a combination of ensuring that no authority dropped in core spending power terms in cash terms, and then the remainder of it was distributed based on a lower tier formula. So in our modelling, assuming that someone like Enfield wouldn't get any of that lower tier services grant. But actually, if you look at the difference in core spending power, the bottom line, between the two different scenarios, actually there's not a heck of a lot of difference for someone like Enfield. I think they'd benefit slightly from having more money going into social care than into SFA, but it's not a vast amount of money, but it's probably slightly better. So I think for most authorities, when I think they've looked at it, there's not a huge difference, certainly upper tier authorities, so there's not a huge difference between the different scenarios, possibly just at the extremes for some authorities that have got very high tax bases possibly, but in the main, I don't think there's a huge amount of difference. Then of course, we need advice on what's going to happen with those other amounts that were announced in the spending review 21, so the family help money, cyber resilience, plus that unallocated amount, the balancing figure between you know, what the DEL was announced at and what we know is going to go through the settlement. So we wait to see what's going to come out for those different amounts over the next 3 years. A quick reminder about what we think is funded from that 4.8 billion. We're pretty sure the pay award's funded. In other words, you've got to fund the pay award from any money that comes through the settlement. There's the same thing with the living wage. I'm fairly sure as well that it's the same thing with the increase in national insurance contributions. I think some people have thought there might be some separate funding outside that 4.8 billion for your increases in national insurance contributions, but we're fairly sure now that you'll have to fund that from anything you get from the settlement. And the same thing with audit fees, the new burdens for the increase in audit fees, you'll be funding that from within the settlement as well. I think the only thing that will be outside of that was announced in the spending review is the cap compensation. Normally that was funded through Section 31 grant separately, and that's what I'd expect to see again. It's quite a lot of money this time because inflation's so high, so the cost of the cap compensation could be really quite significant compared to previous years this time round. One last thing about the settlement, looking at council tax thresholds, just as a reminder, you know, we've got what we've been told the expected thresholds are, so 2% core, 1% precepts, districts the higher of 2% or £5, fire authorities expecting to still be on 2% core and no higher, police and crime commissioners higher at £10 maximum, so the expected figures. But of course, just remind ourselves that the maximum increase in 21-22 was 3%, and some or all of that could be deferred into 22-23. And about a third of authorities didn't take the full 3%, so would be eligible to carry it forward into 22-23. Lots of those were actually county authorities, so you can see, you know, the numbers there in the chart, and then the numbers down the black top bars. They're the number of CCN or county authorities that have the potential to defer council tax. So some of these authorities could increase their council tax by as much as 5% or more in 22-23. So it's a slightly more complicated picture, I think, with council tax in 22-23. A couple of slides now on funding for social care reform, but as I said, I don't have an awful lot of news for you on this. But just as a reminder, 5.4 billion was allocated for social care reforms in the spending review, of which we were told 3.6 billion would come through the settlement. But we don't know what the distribution would be of that. Would it use the existing adult RNF, or would a new relative needs formula be used? We know one's been developed by researchers but not published yet. We've done some modelling based on the research that's available that we've seen, and I think the LGA have done similar sorts of modelling, and it does indicate that there is quite a bit of movement, to be honest, quite a bit of difference between the current adult RNF and what that new adult RNF might mean. That formula itself was developed to go alongside the Care Act, so it should be, I think it's probably much more appropriate to use that formula to distribute the funding for the social care reforms, even if it needs some tweaks to make sure it's current and to make sure it reflects the latest proposals. But it is redistributive, and you can see here it would shift money towards county areas in particular, and away from, tends to move money away from lots of Mets and parts of inner London as well towards more what you might call more affluent county areas. So, you know, there are issues with that new formula, even if it is more appropriate. £1.7 billion is being held back by the Department of Health. That's for a combination of £500 million for workforce reform and £1.2 billion for to improve the wider social care system, including the quality and integration of care. So we don't know what's going to happen to that, or how much of that is going to come through the settlement to local government or through separate grants to local government. I don't know how many authorities have made progress with costing the reforms. Of course, it's not easy because we don't yet know precisely what the reforms will look like. They're based on DIL-NOT, and there are, you know, we kind of know the basic structure, but you'll have seen in the news recently that there were amendments put through to the Care Act framework through the Health and Social Care Bill that's going through Parliament. So if the scheme's changing, then the overall cost will change, and the distribution of that cost is going to change between authorities as well. So the proposal is that was put through Parliament recently was that local authority contributions will not count towards the care cap. So that reduces the benefit of the proposals to many living in the North and Midlands, but it will also reduce the cost of that cap to the authorities in those areas as well. So, you know, it's got really important consequences for how you cost out what these reforms are will mean to you, and then also what the funding might be that you get. News in the last 24 hours or so is that there's going to be a social care white paper published this afternoon, apparently. I think it's going to be a white paper. I'm just giving you the quote from Laura Koonsberg there that white paper's come out this afternoon after PMQs, and apparently that will tell us how the extra £1.7 billion will be divvied up, and various other things as well. I heard it again on the Today programme this morning, so I think we'll look out for that this afternoon. That might tell us more about what's going to happen to that 1.7 billion. Now, Dan, I think I'll hand over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Adrian. So I'm just going to go through the CTB1 analysis. Can you keep tapping this screen? Thanks. So as Adrian said earlier, council tax, even despite the 4.8 billion, the 1.6 billion a year, this trend which I'm showing here will continue to rise. More and more gearing towards council tax will occur in the whole and in each sector. And if we move on to the next slide, that we do this at settlement, we'll do it again at this year's settlement. In our model, we show how the gearing that each type of authority and also your own authority, for those of you members, how that compares. So you see in all of those cases, with the exception of in London, it's only 40% relying on council tax, and Met's at 50%. All the other types of authorities are much more geared towards council tax, which is why council tax is so important. We move on one. Just reiterating the slide that Adrian put earlier on, and some of the indications that Michael Gove has made, as Adrian was saying, around his understanding that there are authorities in the East with pretty good tax bases, and that there's headroom for redistribution. So I guess we need to be aware of that, and therefore our tax base, for it's the resources block, if that was to return, it's the tax base that it looks at, not the Band D. The tax base is even more important. So if we move on one. So in our model, this is we provide this each year after the council tax requirement comes out. Council tax income per head is a function of tax base per head multiplied by Band D, and we monitor both those. This is my authority where I live, an authority that always puts its council tax up as much as it can, but actually has got quite a flat tax base, so it's starting to lose out in that respect. So that's council tax requirement form. But if we move on, what I'm looking at today is the CTB data. So there's a timing difference here. So CTB came out last week, or the week before maybe, and that looks at the tax base, and then you add effectively the CTB in March plus any growth that you might put into it becomes your tax base. You apply an estimated collection rate, and then that comes out in the CTR, and we monitor that as well. But today I'm going to focus in on CTB. So we move on one. So I want to have a quick look at last year's CTB, because that's the first year of COVID, and then come back to this year and see if there's any signs of recovery. I was quite surprised when we did this at some of the results. And then a bit later, we'll look at tax-based changes since 2015 through the CTB1. So in terms of the mechanics, I'm looking at really at the bottom of the council tax benefit 1 form. So the final tax base, but just before that, the council tax support. So your council tax base is basically your housing growth, less those discounts that you give, less council tax support equals your tax base. So that it's those three components. CTB before council tax support, and then after, and then we'll look at the council tax support in the middle. So we move on one. So this is I guess this is the year that incorporates the first lockdown and all the furlough. So in that year, so bearing in mind we're looking between October of the years for the CTB, there were fairly modest increases in growth, probably less than in previous years, because I guess a lot of builders were locked down, and the new homes didn't come forward at quite the rate. But there was also quite a big increase in council tax support across all types of authority, which meant that there were much lower than what we might have expected increases in the tax base. Council tax support wiping out modest growth. You can see the differential again, where you've got districts, redistricts and counties, because they share a tax base, right down to the Mets. Actually, it was a very, very small decrease in tax base across all the Mets. So that was the really badly COVID blighted year. We move on one, we look at what's happened this year, and this is what surprised me, because I might have expected there still to be some residual COVID impact there, but actually what you see is a much bigger boost. You still have a fairly subdued housing growth, which I guess is a knock on from COVID when compared with previous years, but you have quite big significant reductions in council tax support. And I must admit, even where I live in sleepy Tavistock in southwest of the country, every other shop is asking for people, there's jobs going. So I suspect there's quite a move towards full employment, which reflects in reducing council tax support, although oddly in outer London boroughs it's still increasing. So again, that has a differential impact upon the eventual tax base, with again in London seeming to do better in this last year as they did the year before, but not by much. If we move on. So this, we'll whiz through these. These are, and for those of you members of LGI, you'll see yourself on these slides, and you'll get those afterwards. That's the change in tax base in the last year across districts. The one that's dropped off the bottom there is Oxford. I think that is because of an increase in council tax support, which again bucks the trend. But you see quite a big variance in change in tax base. But I think for a lot of us, certainly where I'm working, I was pleasantly surprised that our tax base had increased by 2%. But then when I looked in the detail, that's because council tax support had fallen off so much. If we move on, we'll just wade through the London change in tax bases. That in a London borough, I believe that's Tower Hamlets, racing ahead, lots of building there, and also a reduction in council tax support. Moving on, I think we'll get the Mets. Moving on, I think we'll get the Unitaries. So a mixed picture there, some big increases, some less so, but I don't know, it'd be interesting to see what people think, but generally the tax base figures that have come out are better than I might have imagined prior to them coming out. So the impact of COVID is starting to reverse, or so it seems. So if we move on slightly, so reiterating what was what we said earlier in terms of council tax equalisation, and if there is to be a resource block, it is the tax base and not the bandee that will be important. So if there's going to be some redistribution, if your tax base increased significantly over the last few years, then there's a good chance that you might lose out through any equalisation or resource block style redistribution. And then in a minute we'll look at levelling up. So move on. So this now is apologies, that's wrong, that thing. It's October 15 to October 21, so it looks at 6 years, and the tax base changes, and not surprisingly, Inner London has raced ahead again. But what I hadn't realised is council tax support had reduced significantly prior to COVID, and then has subsequently reduced again post-COVID. So you see differentials in tax base, and we'll just whiz through the next few graphs, which will show again the difference, if you like, in tax base changes. These are just districts right from South Derbyshire, which has grown significantly, down to Staffordshire, which has hardly grown at all. So in terms of equalisation, South Derbyshire might struggle if resources block gets reintroduced, or some form of equalisation, because they do so well out of growth going forward. And if you just whiz through, because we'll let people see as they go through. Again, there's quite big variances across types of authority. What was really interesting to me is Richmond upon Thames has the lowest of any district in terms of their historic tax base increase, with Tower Hamlets the highest. So London, as ever, showing massive differentials between tax base growth. Should say 2015 is, if you like, index of 0, and everything is growth beyond that. But if they're introducing equalisation, I guess where you are on this scale might determine the impact of any equalisation resource block style move. Just whiz through the next 3 or 4 actually, Adrian, because people get to see these in the slides. So finally, just a few words on levelling up, or is it really levelling up, levelling down, levelling off? Could be any of those. At the moment, it doesn't feel very much like the system is very pro levelling up, given that tax base tends to be much bigger in the south. And if we move on to the next graph, I did this a while back. It shows an inverse relationship between spending power increases and indices of multiple deprivation. So the most deprived areas have generally seen the biggest reduction in spending power. That's because of equal cuts and an inability for the tax base to compensate for those cuts. So that is definitely levelling down, isn't it? If we move on and we look at that regionally, generally accepted that where I'm from, God's wonderful county of Yorkshire, plus Humberside / East Yorkshire, the northwest and the northeast are the north, and those are the 3 areas that have seen the most significant spending power reductions, and the southeast, the beautiful south, has raced ahead at the same time. So really not particularly levelling up, and therefore any changes to that feel like they need to be reasonably significant if the lens of levelling up, which Adrian said will be used, is to be successful. And I think my final slide before I pass back to Adrian, all I've done here is I've taken tax bases per head and then I've split them into London, the south, which is actually just the southeast, the north, which is Yorkshire Humberside, northwest, northeast, and then everywhere else, which includes the southwest and all the Midlands places. But again, what you see there is tax base per head is much more prosperous and change slightly more prosperous in London and the southeast, and the grim north, where I'm from, lagging behind somewhat. Although lots of the white ones on the end are Midlands towns such as Leicester, Derby, Nottingham don't have particularly healthy tax bases. So levelling up, I'd suggest, has got a lot to do to correct a system that is now highly reliant on council tax and therefore highly geared to the advantage of more prosperous South East London type areas. And that's me. Back to you, Adrian.
Thanks, Dan. I'm looking at the NNDR3 for 2021 that's just recently been published, in the same way as Dan's just looked at council tax base. In a bit less details, just looking at just start to reanalyse it and start to update our MTFP model for the latest NNDR3 figures. But our sort of first cut of it suggests that actually the outturn for 2021 doesn't seem to be as horrendous as we kind of expected, really. I guess that's from a combination of a lot of support through Section 31 grants for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses. I guess a lot of office space where they haven't been able to make appeals for empty offices yet, or at all, possibly, material change in circumstances possibly, or should be ruled out, because that's what's going through Parliament at the moment. So, and I guess generally, you may get non-payment in places of business rates, but it tends to be a fairly resilient tax base. It's not very movable. It's not related to profits. So I guess we shouldn't possibly be that surprised that actually, as you can see in that chart, retained business rates or above baseline has actually increased slightly in cash terms. You can see the trend line there has slightly taken a bit of a hit, but if you look at 2021, slightly less, it's slightly below that trend line of growth. The 21-22 NNDR1s, which we already had already indicated that things would get back to something close to normal fairly quickly. So as far as we can see from the NNDR3 that we've seen, it doesn't feel like the catastrophe that it might have been for business rates, and it possibly is just a shortish term hit in the trend of growth rate. And that means that if you look into 21-22 and then 22-23, the amount of retained business rates above baseline, might be 1.6, maybe up to 1.9 billion per year. I mean, we're projecting forward there based on average growth rates, but that suggests there could be quite a lot of resource available that could be redistributed if there was to be a baseline reset. Then in terms of what's happened at a class level, again, London has had the strongest growth rates in 2021. If you look at the change in 2021 for those sort of three London designations, the amount above baseline in percentage terms for each of those authorities has climbed by more than any other type of authority. I wonder I'm not quite sure why that would be. Is London, has it been better protected from losses by retail, hospitality and leisure support? Because a lot of the retail bases or the revenue base is from office accommodation, and those kinds of rateable places have not been able to make appeals. So maybe that's why, in some respects, London's been a bit better protected. But then looking at individual authorities versus baseline, we can see here that most authorities are still above the baseline, and in many cases still well above baseline. There are now 28 out of 369 authorities that are below baseline, of which 16 are in the safety net threshold. So that is certainly more authorities who are below baseline, and certainly more authorities in safety net than has been the case in recent years. Some of those who are below baseline have been in that position for a number of years, and you know who you are. You know, things haven't changed that much, but some have got into that position because of what's happened in the last year and the effects of the pandemic, or at least their judgment about the effects of the pandemic on their revenue base. In percentage terms, district councils overwhelmingly remain the most above baseline. As you can see there, the blue blocks on the chart show you district councils and their percentage amounts above baseline. The red block at the far left, the authority with the most retained rates above baseline is inevitably the City of London. Always the outlier's outlier, really. But we thought we'd look as well at what the volatility there is. You know, sometimes you can see the overall figures and think, oh well, yeah, everything's quite placid, but you know, there's quite a bit of volatility at local authority level. So here we've just looked at the NNDR3s in 1920 and compared to 2021. Just looked at the difference between the two, and just looked at the amount above baseline and the variance between those two figures. And as you can see, I guess towards the left-hand side of that chart, where authorities are more above baseline, there's a little bit of a tendency for the authorities actually to have piled on a bit more growth in most cases, although not entirely so. There are movements there, both up and down, for even authorities that are still way above baseline. But what's quite noticeable, I think, is on the far right-hand side. If you look at the reductions in retained rates for authorities that are below baseline or below the safety net threshold, it's quite noticeable how much their retained rates is reduced by, and that starts to make you think that either there's been something very specific that's happened there that's hit their business rate revenues, or they've made judgments about the effect of appeals or non-collection on their revenues, and done so to a much greater extent than the average of other types of authority. And I think that's the latter explanation. I think is probably the more accurate. So if we look at an inland London borough, this is an authority that's usually well above baseline, lots of growth. In cash terms, it's the 5th highest above baseline in 1920, 22 million quid above baseline. So they've had a lot of growth over the years. But based on the NNDR3, they'll be substantially below the safety net threshold in 2021, claiming nearly 16 million quid from the safety net. And if you look at the right-hand chart, you can see what's happened there is that their appeals provision has increased significantly. So for the NNDR1 for 2021, their appeals provision was expected, or the contribution towards it was meant to be, under 10 million. The outturn position is close to 120 million. So they're clearly expecting or they've made a judgment that there will be some very, very serious refunds that they'll have to make based on 2021. Possibly they're thinking material change in circumstances won't go through Parliament. Possibly they're thinking that offices and businesses there will find other ways of reducing their business rates liability. But it's really clear there they've made a very big judgment about how much refunds they think they'll have to pay out in the future in respect of 2021. And looking at a Shire district here, with again, has had pretty strong business rate growth over recent years. But again, their NNDR3 has taken them way below baseline for the NNDR3 for 2021. And again, you can see the driver for that is that authority making a big judgment there about how much they'll have to refund from appeals as well in the future. I think a lot of this is being driven by judgments, not unreasonable judgments in most cases, or in some cases. I'm not saying it's a wrong thing to have done, but you can really clearly see the outliers there about how some authorities have made judgments about the effects of appeals, and other authorities I think have probably been a bit more sanguine. We'll see who was right in the coming years, but it does show that some authorities will get some quite big safety net payments based on 2021. But for local government as a whole, as I said, it doesn't seem like the pandemic has had quite the hit on business rates income that we thought it might have done, which I think is probably good news. So I think that is it for us on the slides. Despite us having a huge number of slides, I think we've probably gone at them at a bit of a gallop to make sure we've got through, and we've finished a couple of minutes early, which is which is a good thing. So Dan, shall we just go to the chat, to discussion, Q&As, and take it from there? I don't know how much has come through.
There's not a lot in the chat. Jen and I just exchanging the view that judgments are judgments, and there's sort of, you know, possibly a bit of gaming, maybe, don't know. So I'll leave that for the side. But yeah, as ever, everyone, feel free to either write stuff in the chat, else unmute yourself and shout up.
Yeah. So, Stuart, I'm going to be. I think are you still on the call still? I don't know if you wanted to make any comments about our wild speculations about the settlement, and whether you think we've gone off the mark, or whether, you know, there's anything you thought we should be thinking about.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
So for those who hadn't gathered, I've moved on from what was then MHCOG at the end of November. So I've not really had any conversations with former colleagues. So I've definitely got no special insight into what they're up to. I do know that they're working very, very hard and under quite a lot of pressure at the moment. So that suggests to me that they're looking at quite a range of different options. And I think in general terms, you've captured the options that they'll be looking at. They'll be looking at what they can do on relative needs, anything they can do on tax-based equalisation, if anything, and how they use the extra money secured in the spending review, which is the 1.5 billion grant each year. Which is currently unidentified in the spending review material, how they use that between the different priorities that are in play. So whether they use some of it for reform, for example, whether they use some of it for social care, whether they use some of it directly for levelling up, or depend on a levelling up effect through the other actions on reform, for example. So I think it's shaping up to be the most interesting settlement for some time. The last two have been essentially holding positions through Brexit and COVID, but the opportunity of a multi-year spending review means that you're kind of obliged to set a path, you know, over the 3-year period, and the field is relatively open. It's also running in some ways a bit later than it might have done because of the reshuffle and new ministers arriving. They'll obviously want to put their own stamp on material. So any progress that had been made before the reshuffle is in a sense put to one side, and the focus is then on the spending review and on the subsequent settlement. So we'll have to wait and see, I guess, but not long to wait now.
No, and I guess there's a levelling up white paper that's due any week now as well. Do you think that would? I guess that's part and parcel of the whole debate about it, isn't it? Really, about what they do in the settlement, or do you think the settlement's got a slightly different set of priorities to it?
No, I think it'll be very important to him to, given that he is the levelling up Secretary of State, that everything he does is either progresses that agenda, or at the very least is can't be seen to be setting it back. So I think there'll be a very, very close link between any documents. Again, I'm not sure where they're up to on the levelling up white paper. It was sort of promised by the end of the year, but I haven't heard anything more recently on that. But there'll definitely be a levelling up lens for the settlement, and an integration between those two sets of things. They're not going to be happening separately.
No.
Stuart, this is at the sort of smaller end of the settlement, the districts. In terms of last year, they put a cash flat settlement through using LTSG for those that were on a cliff edge with New M's bonus. I work for an authority that will be an even bigger cliff edge this year. Do you think there might be a view to ensure that there's a cash flat settlement, which will be quite significant little chunks for a small number of authorities who were so reliant on New Homes Bonus. I do think it'll allow them to actually reduce settlements, have reduced spending power.
So this is all speculation, as I said. The use of the word headroom at the Select Committee was quite interesting, and that sort of implies I'm focusing on the extra money that I've got, and I'm particularly keen not to see any cash losers. But I would like to effect some change within the flexibility that's available to me. So that's the kind of balancing they'll be doing, sort of what's our policy objectives here? What does that mean in terms of numbers? Who's winning, who's losing, to what extent? What can I do about that? And there's myriad possibilities.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. It always happens before Christmas, doesn't it? It's always that a little Christmas present for us to kind of like wait for.
Well, there is a slight consolation that it should be earlier next year. If there is no spending review, then there's no reason why it should go into December of next year. I think we say at this stage there probably won't be one that happens closer to the time.
Yeah, Jeff, I see you've got a hand up, Jeff Garfoot from Durham.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian, and hello to Stuart. I hadn't realised Stuart had escaped kind of government, so good to see Stuart. Yeah, a couple of things. One, it's interesting to hear that it may well be that this year's settlement there's no losers. Kind of it's manipulated to ensure there's no losers. I think that's an interesting precedent for fair funding review for the future, because obviously we're expecting some enormous losers from the fair funding review, so that might set an interesting precedent. Adrian, just on you should expect from our side, the big issue for us is less than $1.5 billion that's in there for headroom than it is for the 3.6 billion for social care linked to the levy. In reality, that's where our risk lies as upper tier authorities. So government had made it clear originally around the care capping issue, and as you'd expect, I've had a team of guys working on that as far as we're concerned, and the impact is quite small. It won't be as small in more affluent areas than Durham, I'm sure. But obviously, all of our modelling now is probably worthless, because it looks like the government are going to change what they were going to do. The issue for us on that one is more linked to the two announcements that have been coming out or kind of in recent times. One is the idea that self-funders can come onto council contracts.
Yeah.
So again, in Durham, self-funders pay an average £200 more than we pay. So I won't even start multiplying those numbers out. But if that happens and they all come under our contracts, then care homes will expect a massive increase in fees. And I don't know whether you've seen the information coming out the last week or so, where it appears the government are going to advise that the money linked to social care levy, the 3.6 billion, is dependent upon councils moving towards a fair cost of care. So it's going to be dependent upon you doing that. And obviously, a fair cost of care for any authority can cost anywhere up to 10, 15, 20% more than you're paying right now. There's a balance in that between, are you simply saying fair cost of care based upon current costs, or are you saying current cost plus giving residential care homes and home care providers enough money to give staff a 20% pay rise? So the big issue that we're going to have is when the allocation methodology comes out, it'll be of interest. So I'm hoping that we see 3 years settlements of that amount. But the thing is, we're going to have absolutely no idea if it's enough.
No, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, Jeff, it's kind of it's that part of it is about the quantum, isn't it? It's kind of how much is for the new cap and means test, how much is for market changes and improvements, how much is it for people who were self-funders being able to use local authority rates, and then there's the other side of it, which is the distribution of whatever resources are available. I hadn't quite picked up that about you'll need to do the fair funding side of things to be able to access the funding, but I mean that's kind of tied back to the quantum, isn't it? Is the quantum of 3.6 billion enough to do all the reforms and effectively to address underfunding of providers in the system? I wonder how much will happen this afternoon on that the other white paper on social care about the 1.7 billion. how much of that has been held back to fund that sort of thing? Well, I mean, I don't know.
Well, first of all, I think none. So from the information we're picking up, we've already picked up the information on the training element, the 500 million. So there's a chunk of it gone. The other 3 announcements coming out at the moment on that are money to be provided to expand extra care.
Yeah.
Secondly, to look at investment in technology to help people stay at home. Number 3, looking at investing in handyman services to help people have work done to their houses. So I mean, those 3 make me laugh because we did those 20 years ago. But yeah, I don't see any of that money that's been held back by the NHS being made available to local government on fees. I don't see any of it being made available at all.
No, I can imagine that. And I think my other worry as well is that you sound like you're very far advanced with what you're doing, Jeff. Speaking to some other authorities, and fairly large upper tier authorities as well, have made nowhere near that sort of progress, from what I could gather anyway. And I just do worry that the sector won't really know what the cost is until it's way, way too late. You know, funding's been settled, the system's been settled, and, you know, a year or 2 later, the sector comes along and says, hang on, that was nowhere near enough for what you've asked us to do. I do worry about that, because I was quite shocked at how unprepared some authorities were.
Yeah, a good example, Adrian, kind of again, based upon the work that you guys have done, we're forecasting, you know, we might get 1.1% of the funding. Depends on which of your models that possibly you use. So we could be looking at 22 million. A 10% fee uplift for care in Durham would cost 17 million.
Yeah.
So we'd be left with 5 million for all of the income issues.
Yeah.
Which isn't going to cover it.
No.
So I think that's what the concern has to be, is that we can be very much focused upon what's happening with the allocation of the 1.5 billion and what happens with new homes bonus and everything else.
Yeah.
There could be an enormous cliff edge coming. So the concerns we've always had as local government is the uncertainty around the fair funding review. Upper tier authorities are going to have the uncertainty of the fair funding review still being there, but also now the uncertainty about, is the social care levy funding going to be anywhere near enough to cover the liabilities?
Yeah. I think with the 1.5 billion, at least we know what you're familiar with what the kind of cost pressures are that are growing and developing. You know, you've been managing that for forever, haven't you? You can kind of like manage that, but the social care reforms just feel like it's just a very different world. And I think less so for you, but certainly for, you know, some authorities, you know, in sort of more affluent counties or parts of the world, that actually the impact of self-funders is going to be huge, and that's going to be where the big cost, but some of the big unknown costs are going to be as well, because almost by definition you don't deal with those people at the moment. So we're waiting for a lot later this later this month. Just having a look to see. Phil from Swale, you're asking about when the revised MTFP model will be out, including NDR3. I've pretty much finished it actually, Phil, and I think I might just put it on the website later this afternoon in draft form, so you can have a quick look at that and see how that works. So that will flow through both into the sort of the overall national numbers as well as the individual authority numbers that you've got as well. If you want to have a look at that. That should be ready fairly soon. But I think we've got for me, I think one of the big issues is going to be about just the scale of reform in 23, 24, and how much that's going to hit us. I don't know what you think, Dan. So.
Yeah, for me, it's part of the NHB cliff edge. This is more of a district perspective because we're more geared towards it, but also the rates reset and whether we'll get any indication in this settlement as to what the plans are for the rates reset. So I work for an authority that is way over baseline, and the moment the rates get reset, that they're going to take a massive hit. And they'll grow back, but it's the uncertainty over that, you know, even if we knew it was happening in 23, 24, then we can plan. If we get another settlement not knowing what's happening in rates reset, it just continues the absolute uncertainty. So from a district point of view, I think that's one of the biggies for districts certainly that have got lots of rates.
Yeah.
Right.
Dan, can I ask a question on that? I'm really curious, coming from a unitary with that district perspective. Is your experience that district councils have invested that figure over the reset, knowing it was going to be reduced in the future? Because you'd have thought that common sense would have said to invest that on non-recurrent expenditure. Are you advising that it's all being included on recurrent stuff? Because that sounds a bit risky.
So I can't possibly comment on individual authorities, but I've worked for authorities who have. Yeah, I think at the start, both UM's bonus and business rates growth was used for one-off, as it should be for for capital. But as times have got tougher, I suspect 151s will say, "Oh, I'll have a little bit this year. I'll have a little bite." And then next year, well, I'll have another bit of a bite. And before you know it, they've eaten a good part of the cake. So you're absolutely right. But I think it's just interesting to see the gearing now towards. I know rates growth isn't in spending power, but it sort of is spending power, isn't it? And some I've done a vulnerability index, and there's one district that gets more. Something like 60% of its spending power from rates growth and UM's bonus, both of which are under threat. Now, whether they've really boosted their reserves and their capital in that time, I don't know. But yeah, it's more of a gearing thing. But some have used it. Some have been absolutely right, as you'd advise, and used it on one-offs.
Yes, you'll be surprised to know my sympathy is very low.
I thought that
Durham doesn't do so grand
Yeah.
on
I think part of the problem, though, Jeff, is about credibility. Officers tell members every year, "Oh, the reset's coming," or this is the last year of Newham's bonus, and there's another year added on, and the reset's pushed back another year. And I think for some of those authorities, the one that Dan's working at the moment, I know officers there have been telling members for 3 years now, the reset's imminent, and it isn't. It has to happen rather. And at some point, it will happen.
It's the story of White Wolf, isn't it? That the wolf still eventually turns up, and the wolf will turn up in the form of Michael Gove, I guess, in the next couple of years. But it'd be nice to know whether it's going to turn up in 23, 24, or 25, 26, which is why a 3-year settlement would be good. Although, as Adrian said, probably less likely the more you hear.
Yeah, then it's more of a case of how big the wolf's teeth are.
Yeah. Jeff, actually, Helen from South Lakeland was asking at the beginning of the session about whether anyone was looking for Bellwyn funds as a result of Storm Arwen, and I said I'd mention it later on when everyone was on the call to see if anyone else was in the same sort of position as South Lakeland. I don't know, Durham, did you get hit that badly, or any of the North East authorities?
Yeah, kind of our whole organisation now is turned on just to one thing at the moment, Adrian, which is we've still got massive drafts of the county that are without power.
Right.
So we're already kind of controlling things through a cost centre, and between you and I, we're fully expecting to send a very large bill to Northern Power Grid.
Right.
So I don't think our expenditure at this stage is expected to go over the Bellwyn limits. But yeah, I'm fully expecting to send an invoice to Northern Power Grid.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, Helen, you're still there, Helen. But I think you were saying that you probably will exceed that threshold.
Yeah, there are power issues. Yeah, we've still got quite a lot of people without power. But our biggest issue was the number of trees that have come down on our land. Again,
Yeah.
seems to be every 10 years I do a Bellwyn for storm damage to trees. So yeah, for us. You're right. We can recover the electricity stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Trees are on us.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so that's your cost you got to deal with. Yeah. I don't know about the Northumberlands. I guess that's the authority that's got that have got really badly hit. They're not one of our subscribers, so they won't be on the call, I don't think. But I might see if I can find out from them whether they're in a similar position, Helen, to you. That's good. Right. I think everyone's everyone's just waiting in anticipation for the settlement in a couple of weeks' time. And my guess is 15th. That's what I'm putting my money on. 15th of December. That's the Wednesday.
Who's got the Christmas party on the 15th?
I'm going for the 14th because we've got full council on the night of the 14th with our first draft budgets, and it's inevitable that I turn up half an hour after the provisional settlement, and some bright Alec goes, "Oh, but you haven't taken that into account," and I'm going, "Yeah, I wasn't a mind reader."
I think there was someone, Helen, that had it was about 4 or 5, 6 years that the settlement had been on the same day as their Christmas party. And that was almost like the best predictor of what date it would be, just by that one thing.
Yeah, I think colleagues from DH, whatever they call these days, Adrian did say, don't book your Christmas dinner for the 14th.
14th, okay. Right. Yeah, we'll get prepared for that. Our plan would be that the day after the settlement, obviously the day itself, we'll do our normal analysis and briefing, probably the follow-up briefing the day after as well, just to wrap up any emerging issues, and then we will do another of these webinars. I think probably the 2 o'clock the day after the settlement, just so that we've got a bit of time to think about the slides and respond a little bit. Obviously we don't have a date, so we can't put that in your diaries yet. But our plan will be to do the webinar at 2 o'clock the day after the settlement. Jane, you're saying Christmas parties on those dates either, but you're going for the 14th. Okay, I think we'll change our expectations. 14th, maybe the 15th. Okay, then I think that's probably anything else.
I've got a question for Jane.
Okay.
Do you have turkey pie at Christmas in Wigan, Jane?
See, but Dan, I'm a Scouser. So yeah, I know it's probably a Christmas pie bomb.
That sounds good. Yeah, we'll
with
book
pea
it.
wet.
We'll book it. That's great. Well,
are we done then, everyone?
I think we are a little bit early. But thanks for everyone for joining us. Thanks for your contributions and your comments. We'll keep you abreast of things as the stuff comes out. We'll try and get something out about the social care white paper tomorrow if it comes out this afternoon. And then the latest model will be on the website in draft form, hopefully later today. So have a look at that, and then we will see you around the settlement time. Thanks very much, everyone. See you soon. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.